Welcome to another Redwall review. We are now at the penultimate book in the series, and the question is, could Brian Jacques give us a book worth reading, given that every book in this long series is written about roughly the same thing with roughly the same types of characters? So let's start with the premise of this book. Brian consistently spells, as you might be able to make out here, the word queen, Quan. This is an old slang term for a disreputable woman. He nonetheless uses the word grammatically within the context of the book as if it's interchangeable with queen, Queen. The character who is a queen refers to herself as having that title as being in power, but again, it's always spelled Quan. So the queen in question is a sable named Valaya. We've never seen sables in the series before, but it's basically a distinction without a difference, as sables are just another member of the Mustelid family, and there have, of course, been countless Mustelid villains in this series. Now, for a period, I really didn't care for this one. I think more than any of the other Redwall books I read, this really felt like Brian Jacques didn't know why he was writing this one, and he was just making it up as he went along. Oftentimes his titles don't seem to fit quite right. They're named for a character who doesn't end up actually being the most interesting or most prominent in the book. And in the case of the Sable Quean, it really, for a long time, felt like he came up with this cool title and didn't know what to do with it. Pretty early on, it's not Valea, but her chief soldier, Zwilt the Shade, another Sable, who really seems like the main villain. And in fairness, Will definitely has some good scenes. There's a moment where he decapitates one of his minions and then taunts the decapitated head. But, regardless of Zwilt being kind of cool in a twisted, evil way, the fact that this book is supposed to be about Valea, gives you a sense for a while it's directionless. And the book is also directionless for a while when it comes to its protagonists. I praised the previous book, Doomwhite, for its ensemble feel, and the Sable Quean has a similar ensemble feel. It constantly feels like it's changing. Is the protagonist Buckler the Hare? Is it Flib the Shrew? Is it Mida the Shrew? Is it just random Redwall elders? But unlike Doomwhite, where you get the vibe of, high school children gradually coming of age and putting together skills, it feels like a successful, purposefully ensemble novel. This one just feels like it's ensemble because Brian can't commit to anything, and the book for a while is just muddy. I think what I found most frustrating is just how big some of the groups of characters are, and I literally did not know who the individual characters were. I couldn't tell you what species they were for, I don't know, 60% of the book. It's not like the earlier books in the series where the names were a bit more human and a bit more distinct. Now there are just Red Wally sounding names, and they all start to kind of blend together in my head. There are a couple of other familiar Brian Jacques mistakes in this one. One flaw I would say he has is he regularly inserts a character fairly late in the story and expects us to be emotionally invested in that character when they don't really have time to be a main character, and their personality is generally just that they're a badass warrior. So in Doomwhite, that was the character of Zarin the Black. Way back in Mariel of Redwall, it was the character of Oak Tom the Squirrel. And in this one, it's Ambravina the Badger. Like, very late in the book, he introduces this character and he's like, okay, she's one of the main character heroes now. And I'm like, no, I don't really care. There have been a million Badgers up to this point. Why should I be invested in this one? The other Brian Jacquesism is him being unclear of whether certain characters are children or adults. So when Ambravina is introduced, she's introduced as a badger maid. It's also implied that she was a traveling companion of an otter named Flander, who was referred to as a child earlier in the book. Yet, as her scenes come along, she's just treated like a giant badger warrior, as powerful and menacing as any of the adult badgers we've seen before. We also see this mistake in one of the book's subplots, which is about the Dibbons, the children of Redwall, being kidnapped by Valea, the Sable Quean. And in some ways, I appreciated that plot point. It felt like a revisiting of the story of Matameo and an attempt to maybe improve on that story, do more creative things with it. But I feel like it suffers a bit because At the beginning, the premise is these really young Redwallers are taken prisoner, but the leader of the group, this shrew named Mida, funnily her name is Mida, I think because she's a middle child. But anyway, the shrew named Mida, but eventually she's just written as an adult, which is kind of strange because she has an older sister named Flib. And Flib actually credibly comes across as a teenager in a coming of age moment. And Mida should seem a lot younger than Flib, but she doesn't. That all said, despite the fact that for the first, I don't know, 50 to 60% of this book, it feels rambly and Brian Jacques is working it out as it goes along, this somehow ends up being, he somehow manages to mold this into a book that remains mysterious and full of surprises in the second half, where suddenly all that bumbling and stumbling becomes the perfect setup for more interesting plot points in the second half. So I was really expecting Valaya to be a total waste of a character. Way back in Marl Fox, for instance, the back of the book suggested the main villain was this queen mother, Marl Fox, who actually disappears from the story very quickly. And it really seemed like he was doing the exact same thing again with the character of Valaya. But what actually happens is he kind of distracts us from her and kind of overplays up Zwilt's strength in the first half. So when Valaya kind of makes her comeback in the second half of the book, it comes as a really dramatic surprise. And it actually emphasizes her uniqueness as a character and the ambiguity. Is she a queen or a Quan queen? Redwall books, not in the most consistent way, but are kind of anti-monarchy. There's certainly this implication that, anyone who proclaims themselves a king or queen really just has a big ego and there's no inherent reason why they should rule. And, they often will end up at least humiliated and, if not killed, for this often evil folly of proclaiming imperial power. Valaya's story feels like one of the better developed versions of that story, even though it has a very bumpy start. The other way the rambliness of this book really works is, as I said, when Brian brings back a plot point from early in the book, it genuinely rings as a surprise. So I mentioned earlier, one of the main characters of this book is a hare called Buckler. And again, in the first half, neither he nor his sidekick, the gluttonous Diggs, a gluttonous hare, what a surprise, really does very much for me. But Brian finds some fun things to do with Diggs in the second half. And as for Buckler, at the very beginning of the book, there seems to be this story about his jealousy of his older brother Claren, because Buckler is a warrior and Claren is not. Claren has no interest in war. He runs away from the Salamandastron mountain fortress to become a peaceful farmer. And yet Claren gets the family warrior heirlooms. And Buckler starts his story with a chip on his shoulder, viewing this as incredibly unfair. And this feels like a detail that it's at the very beginning and disappears from relevance until quite late in the book, where either Brian suddenly remembers it or he was being super clever and just distracting us from it all along. So when he suddenly brings it up and makes it relevant again, you're like, whoa, that was a really cool twist. So look, the Sable Queen is at times a somewhat awkward read. It's also arbitrarily split into four parts, which again gives me the impression Brian Jacques was making things up as he goes along. All the books up to this point, every single one of them was split into 3 sub-books. And for some reason, this one is split into 4. And I don't really know why. But in the end, it becomes quite a rewarding read. And there's even this deranged hedgehog that shows up. This is a character type that Brian Jacques introduced back in Doomwhite, and he does it even better in this book. I love when he comes up with characters who are antagonists, but they don't quite fit the traditional Redwall villain box. There's something weirder or maybe even kind of comedic going on with them. So really appreciated that twist. Let me know your thoughts on Sable Queen. Are you more negative on it, I guess on the second half than I am, or are you more positive on the first half than I am? Let me know. And looking forward to one more Redwall review when I read The Rogue Crew.